In the Laotian border jungle, a downed recon team was about to be surrounded. A failed extraction turned deadly when the Viet Cong formed a tightening noose, hoping time, starvation, and despair would finish what bullets couldn't. Sergeant Eli Warren wasn't your typical Army recon leader. For over 2 decades before Vietnam, he was a wilderness survivalist, raised off-grid in the mountains of West Virginia and known in the field as Ghostman. After evading capture in a triple enemy encirclement without firing a shot, when the Viet Cong set fire to the jungle's food lines and cut off all escape trails, they had no idea they were trapping a man who had spent his entire life learning how to vanish into the wild. Warren turned the jungle against them, laying false trails, building hidden shelters, and reviving ancient tracking and trapping methods that would trigger a psychological war the VC never saw coming. What began as a crash would become a campaign of attrition fought with patience, cunning, and the unforgiving rules of the wild. The borderlands would never be the same after Sergeant Warren taught the enemy what it meant to truly be hunted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Huey dropped like a wounded bird, spinning as it fell. Sergeant Eli Warren gripped the overhead strap with white knuckles, his body rigid against the violent shuddering of the helicopter. Below them, the jungle canopy rushed upward, a sea of green about to swallow them whole. "Brace! Brace!" the pilot screamed over the shriek of failing rotors. Warren locked eyes with Corporal Mateo Tex Ramirez across the cabin. The radio operator's usual grin had vanished, replaced by grim determination. Warren nodded once. "We're not dying today." The impact came with a sound like the world breaking open. Metal tore, glass shattered, men shouted. The jungle floor rose to meet them with brutal indifference. Warren felt himself thrown forward, then everything went silent and black. Consciousness returned with the taste of blood and dirt. Warren blinked away the grit in his eyes, orienting himself by instinct. The helicopter lay on its side, smoke billowing from the engine compartment. Through the shattered windshield, he could see the pilot and co-pilot slumped forward. Neither was moving. "Sound off," Warren called, his voice hoarse from the smoke. He did a quick self-assessment. Cuts, bruises, possibly a cracked rib, but nothing fatal. "Tex here," came a strained voice from nearby. "But I ain't exactly in one piece." Warren turned to see Ramirez pinned beneath a twisted section of the cabin wall, blood seeping through his pants where a jagged piece of metal had impaled his thigh. Mouse. Still breathing. Private Daniel Chan's voice was shaky but clear from where he'd been thrown clear of the wreckage. "Skids present, Sarge." PFC Jimmy Wilcox emerged from behind the crumpled tail section, his round face streaked with dirt and sweat, hands trembling as he clutched his medic bag. "Dobbs." The curt acknowledgement came from Sergeant Clay Dobbs, the weapons specialist already checking his M16, his movements precise despite the chaos around them. 5 survivors. Warren's mind clicked into the familiar pattern of assessment and planning that had kept him alive for 23 months in country. "Skids, get to Tex. Mouse, secure perimeter with Dobbs. I'll salvage what I can." Warren's commands came automatically, his voice betraying none of the dread pooling in his gut. They were deep in hostile territory, miles from the nearest firebase. The extraction had been necessary after their original mission, reconnaissance of suspected NVA movements near the Laotian border, had gone sideways. Now they were stranded in exactly the kind of place they'd been sent to map. As Skids rushed to Tex's side, Warren began a methodical inventory of their situation. The jungle pressed in around the crash site, dense and watchful. The air hung thick with humidity and the metallic scent of fuel. In the distance, a flock of birds erupted from the canopy, disturbed by something, or someone. "Sarge, radios." "Damaged but not dead," Tex called, wincing as Skids examined his leg wound. "Might be able to get something out." Warren nodded and continued his assessment. Their supplies were limited, 2 days of rations per man, standard ammo loads, canteens, first aid. The pilots were confirmed KIA. The map case was intact, showing their position approximately 12 miles southeast of Firebase Coral. "I count 3 RPGs and about 1,000 rounds." Dobbs reported, returning from his weapons check. His face was hard, eyes constantly scanning the tree line. Enough to make our point if Charlie wants to dance. Warren shook his head slightly. We're not here to fight. We're here to survive until extraction. Dobbs scowled. They know we're here. Whoever shot us down is already closing in. We should set up a defensive position, make them pay for coming after us. And announce our exact location to every VC within 5 miles? Warren countered. No, we move out in 10 minutes. Listen, Ghostman. Dobbs used Warren's nickname with thinly veiled contempt. Your backwoods bullshit might work for hunting squirrels, but shut it, both of you, Tex interrupted through gritted teeth. Skid says I can't walk far on this leg, and we've got company coming. Mouse appeared at the edge of the clearing, moving so silently even Warren was impressed. Movement north and east, he whispered. Small groups, moving carefully. They don't know exactly where we are yet, but they're looking. Warren turned to the radio Tex had managed to salvage. It was damaged, the casing cracked and wires exposed, but Tex had always been able to coax machines to life. Firebase Coral, this is Recon Team Echo. We are down. Repeat, down. Tex manipulated the dials as he spoke, his face tense with pain and concentration. Coordinates follow, Static answered, then a broken voice. Echo, confirm position, extraction, delayed, hold. The transmission dissolved into white noise, but the message was clear enough. They were on their own. Warren looked at his team, Tex, pale and sweating, leaning against the wrecked fuselage. Skids, hands steady now as he fashioned a makeshift splint and bandage, but eyes wide with barely contained panic. Mouse, slight and watchful, the youngest of them all but with the sharpest ears and eyes, and Dobbs, coiled tension personified, finger never far from his trigger. Here's what we do, Warren said, his voice low and certain. We leave a false trail north, then double back and head southeast through the ravine. Mouse, your point. Dobbs rearguard. Skids and I will carry Tex. The ravine? Mouse questioned, his brow furrowed. Local villages use those paths, they're probably trapped. Which is why no one will expect us to take them, Warren replied. I'll spot the traps. I've seen them all. He didn't elaborate on how he knew, how his father had taught him to set deadfalls and snares in the hollers of West Virginia, how he'd learned to read the land by necessity rather than training. The Army had given his skills a name, survival specialist, but he'd been surviving long before he wore the uniform. As they prepared to move out, Warren felt the weight of the others' lives settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. He thought briefly of his brother Tommy, who died somewhere not far from here. The jungle had taken him, just as it would take them if Warren made a single mistake. Sarge? Skids appeared at his side, clutching his medic bag. We gonna make it? Warren met the young mechanic's gaze steadily. Yes. It was the first lie he'd told since the crash. Half a mile away, Lieutenant Bao lowered his binoculars, his expression thoughtful as he watched smoke rise from the downed helicopter. His scouts had reported the crash location minutes after impact, but he had held them back, observing. They will run, his second-in-command said confidently. We can pursue and eliminate them before nightfall. Bao shook his head slightly. No, this is not a patrol of conscripts. These are reconnaissance, hunters. He continued watching the distant clearing. The jungle will claim them without our help. And if it doesn't? A thin smile crossed Bao's face. Then hunger will, or thirst, or despair. He turned away from the crash site. Set observation posts. Track their movement, but do not engage unless discovered. You mean to wait them out? His second asked, surprised. Americans have no patience, Bao said simply. They lack the will to endure. Time is our weapon now. What Bao couldn't know was that among the Americans moving beneath the canopy was a man who had learned patience in a different kind of wilderness, a man for whom survival wasn't just training, but instinct, buried in his bones like the mountains of his home. As Warren led his team deeper into the green labyrinth, the jungle closed around them like a fist, erasing their passage. Above them, the sky disappeared, leaving only filtered light and shadow. The war seemed suddenly distant, reduced to the immediate concerns of movement, direction, and the next safe place to set their feet. Behind them, the helicopter smoldered, a beacon they could not afford. Ahead lay only uncertainty and the promise of danger. Warren set his jaw and adjusted his grip on Tex's arm across his shoulders. One step at a time, one breath after another, the oldest prayer of survival. The jungle swallowed them in gradients of green, emerald canopy above, jade undergrowth below, and 1,000 verdant shades between. Warren led them through it like a man reading Braille, his fingers constantly brushing leaves, testing soil, interpreting the land's silent language. "Hold," he whispered, raising his fist. The column froze instantly. Tex bit back a groan as skids eased him against a tree trunk. They'd been moving for 3 hours, making slow progress through the ravine that cut southeast toward Firebase Coral. Warren crouched, examining the narrow game trail ahead. To anyone else, it looked like ordinary jungle floor, a carpet of decomposing leaves and sporadic ferns. But Warren's eyes caught what others couldn't: the slight depression in the earth, the way certain leaves lay against their natural grain. "Punji pit," he murmured, using his knife to carefully probe the ground. The tip sank through the camouflage of branches and leaves, revealing a deep hole lined with sharpened bamboo stakes, each one smeared with human excrement to ensure infection. "Would have taken at least one of us." Dobbs spat quietly. "I still say we should have headed for high ground, defensive position." "And I say we'd be dead," Warren replied evenly, guiding them around the trap. "They're expecting that. Every rise within 2 miles is probably covered." Dobbs fell silent, but the scowl remained etched on his face. Mouse appeared silently at Warren's side. "Another 100 meters and we hit a stream," he reported. "Good cover for our tracks." Warren nodded. The kid was proving valuable, moving, like a ghost, keeping his head even as fear rippled through the group. For all his youth and moral hesitation, Mouse possessed the rare gift of terrain awareness. "Sarge," Skids called softly, "we need to rest soon. Tex is burning up." Warren paused, glancing back at Ramirez. The radio operator's face was flushed, his breathing shallow. The wound in his thigh had been cleaned and dressed, but infection was setting in despite Skid's best efforts. Tex caught his look and forced a grin. "Just vacation sunburn, Ghostman, keep moving." Warren's mouth tightened. They needed antibiotics, proper medical supplies, things they didn't have. But Tex was right. Stopping meant dying. "Stream first," Warren decided. "We'll rest there." The water ran copper-brown but cool, flowing from some unseen source deeper in the hills. Warren allowed a brief 15-minute respite while Skids rewrapped Tex's leg, and the others refilled canteens through improvised filters of cloth and charcoal. "Drink," Warren ordered, passing his canteen to Tex. "Small sips." Tex obeyed, his eyes glassy with fever. "Radio's still getting something," he murmured. "Intermittent, like they're broadcasting on intervals." "Save the batteries," Warren replied. "We'll try again tonight." Dobbs approached, his movements restless, like a caged predator. "We're moving too slow," he said bluntly. "Carrying him is going to get us all killed." Warren didn't look up. "We're not leaving anyone." "Noble way to die," Dobbs retorted. "I'm sure your brother would be proud." The words landed like a physical blow. Warren's head snapped up, eyes burning cold, but before he could respond, Mouse appeared at the stream's edge, breathing hard. "Activity," he whispered urgently. "Northeast, half a click, they've set something up." Warren pushed himself upright, grateful for the interruption. "Show me." Mouse led him up a narrow ridge overlooking a small clearing in the jungle. There, partially concealed by foliage, sat what appeared to be a communications outpost, a small tent with a camouflaged antenna, 2 men operating a radio. "Listening post," Warren murmured. "Triangulating radio signals." Mouse nodded. "They've been talking. I caught some of it." He hesitated. "They're not hunting us, Sarge. At least not directly." "What do you mean?" They're setting a perimeter, wide one, like they're building a fence around us. Mouse's voice dropped lower. I heard one of them say, starvation is more reliable than bullets. Warren felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. This wasn't standard VC tactics. This was something more calculated, more patient. Can you get closer? Hear more? Mouse nodded, though fear flickered across his features. I can try. Be careful. 20 minutes, then back to the stream. As Mouse melted into the undergrowth, Warren surveyed the jungle around them. Suddenly, everything looked different, not just hostile but calculated. He began to notice subtle signs he'd missed before: bent branches indicating false trails, trees with barely visible markings showing patrol routes, ground disturbed in ways that suggested observation posts rather than traps. They weren't just in enemy territory. They were in an invisible cage. When Warren returned to the stream, he found Skids constructing a stretcher from bamboo poles and strips cut from their ponchos. The young medic had transformed in the hours since the crash, fear crystallizing into purpose. It'll distribute the weight better, Skids explained, not looking up from his work. I can brace his leg too, keep it elevated. Warren nodded approval, then turned to find Dobbs cleaning his weapon, again with mechanical precision. We need to talk, Warren said quietly. Dobbs continued his cleaning ritual. About what? Your attitude is compromising this unit. I need your skills, not your opinion on who lives or dies. Dobbs finally looked up, his eyes flat and cold. You think your mountain man act is going to save us? We should be fighting our way out, not crawling through the mud. And that's exactly what they want, Warren replied. To make us panic, expose ourselves. So we just run? Hide? Wait for rescue that isn't coming? Dobbs leaned closer. I've been in this jungle longer than you, Warren. I've seen what happens to units that lose their edge. They disappear. The unspoken accusation hung between them. Like your brother's unit disappeared. Warren felt his control slipping, but forced himself to breathe evenly. We're going to survive. This, Sergeant. All of us, but we do it my way. Their standoff was interrupted by Mouse's return. The young scout moved like a shadow, face drawn with what he'd heard. It's worse than we thought, he whispered. There's a commander, Bao. He's implementing some kind of containment strategy. They know exactly where we are, but they're not attacking. Why not? Skids asked. Because, Mouse swallowed hard. He said the jungle will kill us for them. They're setting up camps around us in a circle, watching all the game trails. No food in, no food out. Warren processed this information, mind racing. Did you see any of their positions besides the listening post? Mouse nodded. 3 that I could identify, maybe more. This Bao, Warren pressed. Did you see him? No, but they respect him. Fear him, maybe. He's patient, methodical. Mouse hesitated. He called us ghosts that will fade away if left alone. A cold smile touched Warren's lips. Ghosts, huh? For the first time since the crash, Warren felt something like clarity. The enemy had revealed their strategy, and in doing so had shown their weakness. Patience cut both ways. As twilight approached, Tex's condition deteriorated. The fever had him alternating between shivering and sweating, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Skids had finished the stretcher, but Warren decided against moving further until morning. We'll set up here, he announced, selecting a depression beneath the arching roots of a massive banyan tree. Mouse, check for vipers. Dobbs perimeter. Skids, stay with Tex. As the others moved to their tasks, Warren collected specific plants he'd been noting throughout their journey. Particular leaves, bark, and berries that his father had shown him in the mountains of home. What's all that? Skids asked, watching. Warren crushed the vegetation into a paste. Mountain medicine, Warren replied. Won't cure him, but might bring the fever down. Skids looked doubtful, but helped apply the poultice to Tex's wound. To everyone's surprise, within an hour, Tex's breathing had eased slightly. Learned that from my daddy, Warren explained quietly as they settled in for the night. Same. Plants grow here as in the hollers, different names, same purpose. Your old man teach you all this survival stuff? Skids asked, eyes wide with new respect. Warren nodded, the memory surfacing. He'd dropped me 10 miles from home with nothing but a knife. Said I'd better make it back by sundown or not bother coming back at all. Jesus, Skids whispered. That's harsh. That was Tuesday, Warren replied with grim humor. Taught me to read the land, though, to listen to what it's telling you. And what's this jungle saying? Dobbs interrupted, returning from his patrol. Warren looked up at the canopy, where the last light was fading. That we're not the first to die here, and we won't be the last. The night settled around them, pregnant with unseen dangers. They took watches in pairs. No one slept alone in this place. During his shift with Mouse, Warren repaired the radio as best he could, following Tex's feverish instructions. Just before dawn, they picked up a transmission. Firebase Coral to Recon Echo. Position confirmed. Extraction delayed. Hold position. Repeat. Hold position. The voice was distant, breaking up, but the message was clear. No one was coming for them anytime soon. We can't stay here, Mouse whispered, eyes wide in the pre-dawn gloom. Not with them circling us. Warren stared into the darkness, thinking. Then slowly, his expression changed, not to fear, but to something harder, more determined. No, he said finally. We don't run. We don't hide. He looked at Mouse. We become the jungle. Lieutenant Bao studied the crude map spread before him, small stones marking the American position and his own observation posts. His men had constructed a carefully laid perimeter, not to trap the Americans, but to contain them like a disease that would run its course. They moved to the stream yesterday, his scout reported. One is badly wounded. Bao nodded, pleased. And now? They've stopped moving. The wounded one cannot continue. Then it begins, Bao said softly. The waiting. His second in command frowned. The colonel expects prisoners valuable intelligence. The colonel is not here, Bao replied evenly. These Americans are different. The trail they left. He hesitated, searching for the right word. It was too careful, too aware. One of them knows the forest. All the more reason to strike now while they are vulnerable. Bao shook his head. No. Time will break them. Hunger. Thirst. Fear. He looked up at the dense canopy above. The jungle does not hurry, yet everything is accomplished. He did not share his deeper intuition that somewhere in that small group of Americans was a worthy opponent, someone who might understand the patient game they were now playing. For the first time in many months, Bao felt a flicker of professional curiosity. Maintain the perimeter, he ordered. Watch, wait, the forest will deliver them to us. At first light, Warren gathered his team. Tex was awake but weak, his eyes clearer after a night of fitful rest. Skids looked exhausted but determined, his hands steady as he checked bandages. Mouse was alert, watchful, constantly scanning the jungle around them. Only Dobbs remained apart, cleaning his weapon again, jaw tight with suppressed anger. We're not moving out, Warren announced. 4 pairs of eyes fixed on him with expressions ranging from confusion to outrage. What do you mean? Dobbs demanded. I mean, we're staying right here, Warren replied calmly. They've set a perimeter to contain us, expecting us to either run blindly into it or starve trying to avoid it. So your solution is to sit here and die? Dobbs stood, fury etched on his features. My solution, Warren said, is to become what they fear. He looked at each man in turn. They think we're going to behave like typical Americans, impatient, aggressive, desperate. So we're going to disappoint them. He knelt, drawing in the dirt with his knife. We make this place invisible. We find water. We hunt. We wait. He glanced at Tex. We heal. And when they think we've vanished into thin air, we slip through their lines one night and make for Firebase Coral. That's insane, Dobbs protested. We can't just… Actually, Tex interrupted, his voice weak but clear. It's brilliant. He managed a shadow of his usual grin. They expect us to panic, to make noise if we go silent. They'll have to come looking, Warren finished. And when they do, they'll be on our ground, not theirs. Mouse nodded slowly, understanding dawning. We're not running from the trap. No, Warren agreed. We're building our own. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Skids raised his hand tentatively. I don't know how to hunt, Sarge. Warren almost smiled. I do, and you're going to learn. He stood, feeling a strange calm settle over him. This jungle wanted to consume them just as the mountains had once threatened to consume him. But he had mastered those peaks and hollows, turned their dangers into advantages. He would do the same here. Get some rest, he told them. At noon, we start becoming ghosts. As his team dispersed, Warren stared out into the dense green labyrinth surrounding them. Somewhere out there, unseen eyes were watching, waiting for them to break. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The jungle had claimed his brother. It wouldn't claim him, or any of his men. Not today, not ever. By midday, Warren had selected their new home, a narrow ravine where two massive limestone formations created a natural shelter beneath their overhang. A trickle of water seeped from the rock face, feeding a small pool before disappearing underground. Dense foliage concealed the entrance, and the canopy above was so thick that aerial observation would be nearly impossible. It's perfect, Mouse whispered, running his hand along the cool stone. How did you find it? Warren knelt by the water, testing its clarity. There are places like this back home, hidden pockets where the land protects itself. He glanced up at the rocky walls. My daddy used to say that mountains keep secrets for those who know how to ask. Skids and Dobbs maneuvered Tex's stretcher into the ravine, the radio operator drifting in and out of consciousness. His leg was swollen beneath the bandages, the skin around the wound angry and hot. Home sweet home, Warren announced quietly. Skids, get Tex comfortable. Mouse, help me gather materials. Dobbs, secure the area. For once, Dobbs didn't argue. The sergeant disappeared into the surrounding jungle, M16 at the ready, while the others began transforming the ravine into what Warren called their invisible camp. Warren worked methodically, drawing from memories of his childhood. He showed Mouse how to weave shelters from bamboo and broad leaves, suspended above the ground to avoid crawling things and dampness. He constructed a small fire pit where flame and smoke could be controlled, contained, and directed away from eyes that might be watching. Never build on the ground, Warren explained, lashing bamboo poles together for a raised platform. In the mountains, it was because of snakes and flooding. Here it's that plus 100 other things that'll kill you in your sleep. Mouse worked beside him, nimble fingers quickly adapting to the techniques. Did you really grow up like this? In the wild? Warren's hands never stopped moving. Not by choice. My old man was prepared for the end of the world. Moved us deep into the hills when I was 6. Said society was a thin veneer that'd peel away at the first sign of trouble. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Guess he wasn't all wrong. Is that why you joined up? To get away? Warren's rhythm faltered briefly. No, that was because of Tommy. He secured a knot with more force than necessary. My little brother. He enlisted right out of high school, all fired up about serving his country. 6 months later, we got the telegram. Mouse fell silent, sensing the weight of the unspoken. MIA, Warren continued after a moment. That's all they told us. Missing in action, presumed dead, somewhere in this godforsaken country. He looked up at the canopy. I enlisted the next day. Figured if anyone could find him, it'd be me. Telling. And preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Did you find anything? Warren shook his head. Just more jungle, more war. He straightened. surveying their work. That's enough talking. We need to set up water collection and purification next. By evening, the ravine had been transformed. Elevated sleeping platforms lined the walls. A small, nearly smokeless fire burned in a carefully constructed pit, where the flames remained invisible from more than 10 feet away. Warren had fashioned several bamboo tubes to collect and filter the seeping water, providing a slow but steady supply of drinking water. Skids had created a softer bed for Tex using gathered moss and leaves beneath a poncho. The radio operator's fever still raged, but he was conscious, watching their industry with glassy eyes. "Nice digs, Ghostman," he rasped when Warren approached with water. "Very rustic." Warren helped him drink. "How's the pain?" "Like someone's taking a blowtorch to my leg," Tex admitted. "But I've had worse hangovers in El Paso." He attempted a grin that became a grimace. Warren examined the wound. The infection was spreading despite Skid's best efforts with their limited supplies. "I'm going to try something else," he said. "Mountain medicine again?" Tex nodded weakly. "Whatever. Works. Just don't let me slow you all down." "You're not slowing anyone," Warren replied firmly. "We're all getting out of here." As darkness fell, Dobbs returned from his patrol. His face was set in hard lines, jaw clenched. "They're out there," he reported tersely. 3 observation posts that I could identify, probably more." "Did they spot you?" Warren asked. Dobbs looked insulted. "Of course not, I'm not some FNG." Warren nodded. "Good. Tomorrow we start setting traps and false trails. Tonight we rest." "Rest?" Dobbs snorted. "While they close the net around us?" "Yes, rest," Warren repeated calmly. "Because tomorrow's going to be harder than today. And the day after, that will be harder still." He divided the group into watch rotations, paired again for safety. When his turn came, Warren sat at the ravine entrance, listening to the jungle's night sounds. A symphony of insects, distant monkey calls, and the occasional rustle of something moving through the undergrowth. Beside him, Skids fidgeted nervously. "How do you know which sounds mean danger?" "The silences," Warren replied. "Animals go quiet when predators move." Skids considered this. "So you're saying listen for when there's nothing to hear?" Warren nodded. "In the mountains, when the birds stop singing, something's coming. Same here." They sat in companionable silence for a while. Then Skids spoke again, his voice barely audible. "I'm scared, Sarge. I don't want to die out here." Warren turned to look at the young medic. In the filtered moonlight, Skids seemed even younger than his 20 years. A farm boy from Ohio who should have been fixing tractors instead of patching wounds. "Fear's normal," Warren said. "Keeps you sharp. It's panic that kills." "How do you stay so calm?" Warren stared into the darkness. "I wasn't always. First time my daddy left me in the woods, I cried for hours. Then I realized nobody was coming. For me but me." He shifted his position slightly. "You learn to push fear aside and focus on what needs doing next. One step at a time." He didn't add that fear was his constant companion. Not fear of dying, but of failing the men who now depended on him. Of losing them, as he had lost Tommy. The second day brought new challenges. Hunger began gnawing at them as their meager rations dwindled. Warren spent the morning fashioning simple traps from vines and bamboo, setting them in carefully selected locations while teaching Mouse and Skids the techniques. "The trick isn't the trap itself," he explained, bending a sapling to create tension. "For a snare, it's placing it where animals actually go. Look for signs, droppings, worn paths, chewed vegetation." He sent Mouse to gather certain fruits and roots he recognized from his training, showing him which ones were safe and which would kill a man within hours. Skids stayed with Tex, applying a new poultice Warren had created from crushed leaves and tree sap. Dobbs, meanwhile, grew increasingly restless. He paced the ravine, checking and rechecking his weapon, muttering under his breath about sitting ducks and death traps. When Warren returned with 3 small jungle rats from his traps, Dobbs watched with barely concealed disgust as he skinned and prepared them. "This is what we've come to?" Eating rats while Charlie surrounds us? Warren didn't look up from his work. Protein is protein. You don't have to eat it. Oh, I'll eat it, Dobbs replied. I just wonder if this is your grand strategy. Survive. On rats until what? Rescue that isn't coming? Or do we eventually eat each other? Warren continued his methodical preparation. We adapt. We gather strength. We find weaknesses in their perimeter. He skewered the meat on sharpened bamboo sticks. And when the moment's right, we move. If there's any of us left by then, Dobbs muttered, stalking away. By afternoon, a small miracle occurred. The paste skids had applied to Tex's wound combined with regular cleaning and Warren's herbal treatments seemed to be working. The angry red streaks had receded slightly, and Tex's fever had dropped enough for him to sit up and take solid food. What's in this stuff? Skids asked, examining the green-brown poultice with newfound respect. Warren shrugged. Plants that fight corruption. My grandmother was Cherokee. She showed my daddy and he showed me. He checked Tex's forehead. He's not out of danger. The infection could surge back any time. Still, Skid said optimistically, it's working better than my field kit. Tex managed a weak laugh. Maybe you should trade your medic badge for some mountain man mojo, Skids. As evening approached, Mouse returned from foraging with a thoughtful expression. He'd collected the fruits and roots Warren had specified, but seemed distracted. Something wrong? Warren asked quietly. Mouse hesitated. I'm not sure. I found something odd, about half a click west. I think you should see it. Warren followed him through the dense undergrowth until they reached a small clearing. There, partially buried beneath roots and years of accumulated soil, Mouse had uncovered what appeared to be a metal box. NVA markings, Mouse pointed out. But it's been here a long time. I only noticed because the rain had washed away some of the covering soil. Warren knelt beside the cache, carefully extracting it from its hiding place. Inside were waterproofed packets of papers, most deteriorated beyond readability, and a crude map drawn on oilcloth. Mouse crouched beside him. I can make out some of it. Supply routes mostly, but look here. He pointed to markings near their position. This area is circled. There's writing I can't fully translate, but it mentions something about American, interest and priority zone. Warren studied the faded markings. Our crash wasn't random, he said slowly. This whole sector is significant somehow, which means our original recon mission might have been more important than we knew, Warren finished. He carefully folded the map and tucked it into his pocket. We need to get this back to base. It could explain why no one's rushing to pull us out. As they made their way back to camp, Mouse spoke hesitantly. Sarge, what if they know exactly where we are, but there's something else going on? Something they're not telling us? Warren considered this. Keep it between us for now. No need to add to everyone's worries. But as they approached the ravine, shouting erupted from inside, Dobbs's voice raised in anger, and Skids trying to intervene. Warren rushed forward to find Dobbs holding Mouse's pack, emptying its contents onto the ground. What's going on? Warren demanded. Dobbs whirled, face flushed with rage. Ask your pet scout. I found him with these. He thrust forward several small packages of rice wrapped in banana leaves, food that wasn't from their rations. I found them, Mouse protested. Near the cache. They were sealed, preserved. Bullshit, Dobbs snarled. You've been meeting with them, haven't you? That's how you know so much about their movements, their language. Warren stepped between them. Stand down, Sergeant, now. He's a liability, Dobbs insisted. His family's from China. How do we know where his loyalties lie? I was born in San Francisco, Mouse shouted, genuine hurt in his voice. My father fought in Korea for America. I said stand down, Warren repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. That's an order. The two men locked eyes, the tension crackling between them. Finally, Dobbs backed away. This isn't over, he muttered. When Dobbs had moved to the far end of the ravine, Warren turned to Mouse. The rice? Like I said, it was near the cache. Preserved rations. I thought... Mouse swallowed hard. I thought it might help Tex. Give him strength. Warren nodded, slowly. Next time, tell me first. We can't afford suspicion right now. That night, as darkness closed around their hidden camp, Tex's fever spiked suddenly. He began thrashing on his bed, crying out incoherently. Hold him down, Skids instructed, as Warren rushed to help. He'll tear the wound open. They restrained the delirious radio operator as best they could while Skids tried to cool him with damp cloths. Through his fevered ramblings, fragments of Tex's hidden life emerged. Don't tell Maria. The money's under the floorboard, he muttered. Gotta send it home. Pay the doctor. Baby's coming. Warren exchanged a glance with Skids. Neither had known Tex was expecting a child back home. The bull didn't throw me. I let go, Tex continued, eyes open but seeing something far away. Let go, like Tommy did. Falling. Always falling. Warren stiffened at the mention of his brother's name. Tex had never met Tommy. Couldn't have. It's the fever talking, Skids said quietly, mixing up stories he's heard. But Warren wasn't certain. In moments of delirium, men often spoke truths they'd never say conscious. Through the night, they fought to bring Tex's fever down. Skids worked tirelessly, applying every remedy they had available. By dawn, his dedication paid off. Tex's fever broke, leaving him exhausted but lucid. What happened? Tex asked weakly. You took a trip without leaving the ravine, Warren replied. Said some interesting things along the way. Tex's eyes flicked away. Fever talk. Doesn't mean anything. Warren didn't press. Every man carried secrets in this war, some heavier than others. As morning light filtered through the canopy, Warren emerged from the ravine to check his traps. To his dismay, he found them all empty. Not sprung, simply empty of game that should have been there. The jungle seemed eerily quiet, devoid of the usual sounds of birds and monkeys. He moved deeper into the surrounding area, looking for signs. What he found sent a chill through him. Small controlled fires had been set throughout the perimeter, not to spread but to drive wildlife away. The Viet Cong were implementing a scorched earth policy in miniature, eliminating potential food sources. When he returned to camp, Warren found Mouse waiting anxiously. Something's wrong, the young scout said immediately. The fruit trees I found yesterday, they've been stripped, completely, and not by animals. Warren nodded grimly. They've figured out our strategy. They're removing everything we could use to survive. Mouse's eyes widened. This commander, Bao, he must have guessed what we're doing. It means we're having an effect, Warren replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. They wouldn't bother if they weren't concerned. But privately, he realized they were now in a deadly race against time. Without food, their strength would fade quickly. Without strength, they couldn't escape the closing net around them. He spent the morning extending their water collection system, creating additional filters using sand, charcoal, and cloth layers inside bamboo tubes. Water, at least they would have. But a man couldn't live on water alone, not for long. By midday, hunger had become everyone's constant companion. The meager rations they'd salvaged from the crash were gone. The small animals Warren had managed to trap earlier were just memory. Dobbs grew more volatile, his anger barely contained beneath the surface. Even Skids, normally cheerful despite everything, became quiet and drawn. Only Mouse seemed to adapt, his slight frame perhaps requiring less sustenance. He continued to scout the perimeter, always returning with valuable intelligence but increasingly less food. Tex, though improving, remained too weak to move far. He worked diligently on the radio, coaxing occasional transmissions from Firebase. Coral, always the same message. Hold position. Extraction pending. Pending what? Dobbs finally exploded after hearing the latest transmission. The second coming? We're starving here. Warren, cleaning his knife nearby, spoke without looking up. "We've been here 3 days. A man can go 3 weeks without food." "Easy for you to say, mountain man," Dobbs sneered. "You probably lived on tree bark and squirrels growing up." "Sometimes," Warren acknowledged calmly, "when winter was hard." The simple admission seemed to deflate Dobbs momentarily. He stared at Warren with something between resentment and grudging respect. "This isn't going to work," he said finally, his voice lower. "You know that, right? They're strangling us." Warren tested his knife's edge against his thumb. "Maybe, but they're also committing resources to doing it, resources they can't use elsewhere." "So we're bait? Diversion?" "We're survivors," Warren corrected. "For as long as it takes." That evening, as the group huddled around their small concealed fire, Mouse carefully unfolded the map they'd found in the cache. "I've been studying this," he said, "and I think I've translated more of the markings." He pointed to an area about 2 miles southwest of their position. "There's something here. The writing calls it the White Ghost Building in Vietnamese." "Probably means nothing," Dobbs muttered. "Actually," Tex interjected, his voice stronger than it had been in days, "it might mean everything." He shifted carefully to look at the map. "When the French were here, they built outposts throughout the region. Most were abandoned after Dien Bien Phu." Warren studied the marking. "How far did you say?" "About 2 miles, Mouse replied. "Through dense jungle, but I found a game trail that runs in that general direction." A plan began forming in Warren's mind. If it's French, it might have supplies, medical equipment, maybe even a more powerful radio. Or it could be crawling with VC, Dobbs countered. "A trap." "It's a risk," Warren acknowledged. "But we need something to change our situation." He looked at each member of his team, assessing their condition. Tex was improving but still weak. Skids was exhausted from caring for him. Dobbs was unpredictable, his frustration making him potentially dangerous. Mouse, despite his size, had proven the most adaptable besides Warren himself. "Tomorrow," Warren decided, "Mouse and I will scout this outpost. The rest of you maintain the camp." Dobbs opened his mouth to object, then closed it again. For once, he seemed to recognize the logic of the plan. "What if you don't come back?" Skids asked, voicing what everyone was thinking. Warren's gaze was steady. "If we're not back by nightfall, head east toward Firebase Coral. Use the radio to guide you." He turned to Dobbs. "You'll be in command." The acknowledgement of Dobbs's official rank seemed to temper the sergeant's hostility. He nodded curtly. As the others prepared for sleep, Warren sat at the ravine entrance, staring into the darkness. The jungle seemed to breathe around him, alive with unseen threats and hidden possibilities. Somewhere out there, Bao was orchestrating his patient strategy, believing time was on his side. Warren pulled his knife, turning it in the dim light. His father had given it to him on his 12th birthday, after he'd survived his first 3-day test in the mountains alone. "You've earned this," his father had said. "Now you can survive anything." Warren hadn't understood then what his father was preparing him for. Couldn't have imagined this green hell thousands of miles from the blue ridges of home. But as he traced the worn handle of the knife, he felt a grim certainty settling in his bones. His entire life, every harsh lesson, every solitary hunt, every night spent learning the language of wilderness, had been preparation for this moment, for keeping these men alive in a place designed to kill them. Tomorrow would bring new dangers. The abandoned outpost might offer salvation or death, but tonight, in their invisible camp carved from the jungle's reluctant mercy, they had already achieved the impossible. They were still breathing, still fighting, still human in a place that stripped humanity away like layers of skin. And for now, that was enough. Dawn broke with reluctant light, filtered through layers of mist and canopy. Warren and Mouse prepared quietly, checking weapons and securing minimal gear. 2 canteens, ammunition, a compass, their knives. Nothing that would slow them down if they needed to move fast. "We leave no trail," Warren instructed, his voice barely above a whisper. Step where I step. Touch nothing unless I do first. Mouse nodded, eyes alert despite the hollow hunger visible in his face. 3 days of near starvation had sharpened his features, but also his senses. The youngest of them seemed to be adapting, most quickly to their circumstances. Watching Warren, learning, becoming something new in this green crucible. Tex propped himself up on his elbows, color returning to his face, though weakness still evident in every movement. "The radio's picking up more chatter," he reported. "Something's got them stirred up, more movement than before." Warren absorbed this. "They're getting impatient." "Good. Or reinforcing," Dobbs countered, checking his weapon for what must have been the 100th time. "You might be walking into a reception committee." "That's why we're going quiet," Warren replied evenly. He turned to Skids. "Keep him hydrated. Change the bandage at noon. If we're not back by dark, head east toward Firebase Coral." Skids finished. "We remember." Warren studied the young medic's face, the dark circles under his eyes, the strain of responsibility. "You've done good work, Skids. Kept him alive when most wouldn't have managed it." The simple praise brought color to Skids' cheeks. He nodded, suddenly unable to speak. "Touching," Dobbs muttered. "Save the goodbye speech. You'll need your breath for running." Warren ignored him, kneeling beside Tex instead. "Anything specific I should look for radio-wise? Tubes, transistors, copper wire. Even old French equipment might have components we can use." Tex reached out, gripping Warren's arm with surprising strength. "Be careful, Ghostman. I've got a kid coming I'd like to meet someday." Warren covered Tex's hand with his own. "You will." He stood, turning to Mouse. "Ready?" The young scout nodded, slipping his arms through the straps of his small pack. "Ready." Together they melted into the undergrowth, leaving the ravine and their companions behind. They moved like shadows through the jungle, Warren leading, Mouse following so precisely in his footsteps that they might have been one person. The route took them southwest, avoiding the known observation posts while maintaining their bearing toward the mysterious outpost. Warren set a careful pace, conserving energy while covering ground. The hunger gnawing at their bellies couldn't be ignored, but it could be compartmentalized, another discomfort to be acknowledged and set aside. He'd gone hungry often enough as a boy to recognize the stages. First the sharp pangs, then the hollow emptiness, finally the strange clarity that came when the body began consuming itself. They were approaching that third stage now, dangerous but useful. Every sense heightened, every movement deliberate. An hour into their journey, Warren paused at a small stream. Wordlessly, he pointed to a cluster of plants growing along the bank, thick stalks with fibrous roots. Mouse understood immediately, helping him dig up several of the roots and rinse them in the current. "Eat," Warren instructed, demonstrating how to strip the outer layer and chew the starchy core. "It's not much, but it's something." The root was bitter and tough, but the carbohydrates it contained would provide temporary energy. They ate methodically, not for pleasure but necessity, like refueling machines. "My father would know the name for these," Mouse said quietly as they continued on. "He studied botany before the war, before he had to become something else." Warren glanced at him. It was the first personal detail Mouse had volunteered about his family. "What did he become?" Warren asked, ducking beneath a low-hanging branch. Mouse's expression tightened. "A ghost, like all of us who don't fit neatly into America's idea of itself. He negotiated a fallen log with surprising grace. He fought in Korea, came back with medals and nightmares, but people still called him Chinaman to his face, still treated him like the enemy." Warren said nothing, letting the young man talk. Words were rare currency out here, each one valuable. "That's why I enlisted," Mouse continued after a moment. "Thought maybe if I served, proved myself." He shook his head. "Stupid, right? As if bullets care what your face looks like." "Not stupid," Warren replied. "Just human, wanting to belong." They fell silent again as they approached a steeper section of jungle. The ground began to rise, the vegetation changing subtly. Fewer broadleaf plants, more conifers and thick undergrowth. The trail Warren had chosen curved around the base of a small hill, following the natural contours of the land. Abruptly he stopped, raising his fist in the signal to halt. Mouse froze instantly. Warren pointed silently to a nearly invisible tripwire crossing the path ahead. A thin strand of metallic wire disguised with mud to match the surrounding earth. Mouse's eyes widened as he recognized the trap they'd nearly triggered. With practiced movements, Warren traced the wire to its source, a crude but effective explosive made from a dud artillery shell, rigged to detonate when the wire was disturbed. He motioned Mouse to back up, then carefully guided him around the danger. "They're getting closer to our ravine," Mouse whispered once they were safely past. "That wasn't there 2 days ago." Warren nodded grimly. "The net's tightening. One more reason to find what we're looking for." They continued on, more cautious now, every step measured twice. The jungle had transformed from refuge to gauntlet, each meter potentially deadly. Yet Warren moved with a confidence that Mouse found himself adopting, not fearless but precise, deliberate, reading the land's warnings before they became threats. Near midday, the terrain changed again. The undergrowth thinned, giving way to an area where the canopy had been broken long ago. Sunlight penetrated to the forest floor in dappled patterns, illuminating what had once been a clearing but was now reclaimed by secondary growth. And there, half consumed by vegetation, stood the remains of the French outpost. It wasn't large, a main building of crumbling white stone, a smaller structure that might have been barracks and the rusted skeleton of what appeared to be a communications tower. Vines crawled over everything, roots prying apart mortared stones with the patient strength of decades. "The white ghost building," Mouse whispered. They approached cautiously, Warren scanning for signs of recent human presence. He found none. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no fresh markings. The place had the stillness of a tomb, abandoned to the jungle's slow digestion. "Check the perimeter," Warren instructed. "I'll take the main building." Mouse nodded and slipped away, moving. In a wide circle around the outpost, Warren approached the central structure, M16 ready, senses alert for any sound or movement that didn't belong. The entrance was a dark rectangle, its door long since rotted away. Warren paused at the threshold, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom within. The air smelled of mold and decay, with something else beneath. A metallic tang that might have been old blood or simply rusting equipment. He stepped inside, moving from shadow to deeper shadow. The interior was a single large room, its plaster walls stained with water damage and covered in faded graffiti. Broken furniture lay scattered about, wooden desks reduced to splinters, the remains of a filing cabinet, chair frames with their seats long since deteriorated. In one corner stood what he'd been hoping to find, a massive radio console, its metal casing streaked with rust, but still largely intact. Warren approached it slowly, running his fingers over the dials and switches. Most were frozen in place, corroded by humidity and time, but some of the internal components might be salvageable. As he examined the radio, Warren became aware of markings on the wall behind it, Vietnamese characters carved deeply into the plaster, more permanent than the faded graffiti elsewhere. He couldn't read the script, but the crude drawings accompanying the words needed no translation. Stick figures lined up against a wall, other figures pointing what were clearly rifles at them. "Executions," came Mouse's voice from the doorway. "The writing says this was a place of judgment where traitors were purified." Warren turned. "Viet Minh?" Mouse nodded, stepping into the room. "During the French occupation, collaborators were brought here." His eyes traced the carved characters. "It says the walls still hear their confessions." A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature crawled up Warren's spine. He turned back to the radio, focusing on the practical task at hand. "Help me open this," he said. "We need to get to the components inside." Together they pried off the rusted access panel, revealing the radio's inner workings, a complex array of tubes, capacitors, and circuitry partially protected from the elements. Warren recognized enough to know that techs would consider it a treasure trove. We can carry the essential parts, he decided, not the whole unit. As Mouse helped him extract the most promising components, Warren felt a growing unease. The outpost's silence was too complete, the air too still. Places where death had occurred in numbers often retained a palpable weight. He'd felt it in certain hollows back home where Native Americans had been slaughtered generations ago, where the trees grew twisted and wildlife avoided the ground for no apparent reason. This place had that same wrongness. The jungle, usually humming with life, seemed to hold its breath around the crumbling buildings. "Let's check the other structure," Warren said once they'd salvaged what they could from the radio. "Then we move out." The smaller building proved to be barracks, as he'd suspected. Little remained except rusted bed frames and rotting footlockers. Mouse found a cache of weathered papers tucked into a crack in the wall, documents protected from the worst of the elements by some unknown soldier's foresight. "French military reports," he explained, carefully unfolding the brittle pages. "Supply requisitions, patrol logs." He paused, his expression changing. "And this." He handed Warren a small, leather-bound book, a journal, its pages warped but still readable. The entries were in Vietnamese, but tucked between the pages was a faded photograph, a much younger Lieutenant Bao in uniform, standing beside another officer. "It's his," Mouse whispered, an edge of awe in his voice. "Bao's journal from when he fought the French." Warren stared at the photograph. The face was younger, less hardened, but the eyes were unmistakable, intelligent, calculating, patient. The eyes of the man currently orchestrating their slow death. "Can you read any of it?" Warren asked. Mouse carefully turned the pages. "Some, it's poetic, philosophical. He quotes Sun Tzu a lot." He continued scanning. "Here's something. The Americans believe in fire and metal. They do not understand water and time. Water shapes stone not through force, but through persistence. Time erodes resolve more surely than bullets." Warren nodded grimly. "Know your enemy. He's been playing this game a long time." "There's more," Mouse said, turning another page. "References to campaigns against American units, training methods." He looked up, eyes wide. "He mentions a unit that went missing near the Laotian border in '67. Says they broke them using isolation tactics. Same thing he's trying with us." Warren felt a coldness settle in his chest. Tommy had disappeared in '67 near the border. Could it be the same unit? He wanted to ask, to demand Mouse translate every word, but discipline held him back. The mission came first. Personal ghosts could wait. "Pack it," he instructed. "All of it. We need to move." As Mouse carefully stowed the documents, Warren conducted a final sweep of the outpost's grounds. Behind the barracks, partially hidden by undergrowth, he discovered a well, its stone rim cracked but still intact. Testing the rusty hand pump yielded nothing, but the shaft itself might still contain water. He was lowering a canteen tied to a length of vine when he heard it, a soft rustle from the jungle's edge that wasn't wind or wildlife. His body tensed, senses instantly alert. 3 meters to his left, a shadow separated from the dappled darkness between trees. Then another, and a third. Viet Cong scouts moving with the stealth of men born to the jungle. They hadn't spotted him yet, their attention focused on the main building where Mouse was still gathering the papers. Warren counted at least 5, AEO. Small patrol, probably part of Bao's observation network. Silently, Warren eased the M16 from his shoulder. He could take the first 2, maybe 3, but the others would scatter, raise the alarm. The sound of gunfire would bring more. Their position would be compromised, their mission failed. No, there had to be another way. Moving with glacial slowness, Warren retreated behind the remains of a low stone wall. His mind raced through options, discarding each as too risky or too slow. Then his eyes fell on the structure of the old communications tower, its metal skeleton, still standing, though barely. A plan formed in seconds. Warren worked his way around the perimeter of the clearing, staying low, using the undergrowth as cover. When he reached the tower, He examined the rusted support struts. As he'd suspected, decades of exposure had weakened the metal at crucial junctures. With the right pressure in the right places, he unsheathed his knife and began scoring one of the main supports, deepening an existing crack in the metal. It wouldn't take much. The structure was barely standing already. All he needed was enough noise and distraction to slip away with Mouse. From his position, he could see the VC patrol spreading out, approaching the main building with disciplined caution. They'd find Mouse within minutes. Warren finished weakening. The support then moved to an adjacent strut and repeated the process. When both were prepared, he collected several stone fragments from the ground. Timing would be everything. He let out a low whistle, the call of a particular jungle bird that he and Mouse had established as a warning signal. Through the broken window of the main building, he saw Mouse freeze, instantly alert. Warren drew back his arm and hurled the first stone at the main building's far side, away from both Mouse and the patrol. The clatter of it striking the stone wall caused the VC soldiers to turn sharply, weapons raised. In that moment of distraction, Warren threw a second stone, this time at the weakened tower supports. The impact sent vibrations through the rusted metal, which groaned ominously. The patrol's attention shifted again, drawn to the new threat. Warren signaled frantically to Mouse, who appeared at the building's rear window. The young scout understood, immediately, slipping out and moving in a low crouch toward Warren's position. Before the patrol could reorganize, Warren launched a final, larger stone at the tower. This time, the weakened supports gave way with a screech of tearing metal. The entire structure began to collapse, decades of rust and decay finally claiming victory over French engineering. The noise was tremendous, screaming metal and crashing debris. The VC patrol scattered for cover, momentarily disoriented. In the chaos, Warren and Mouse slipped into the jungle, moving fast but silently, leaving the outpost and its ghosts behind. They didn't slow their pace until they'd put half a mile between themselves and the outpost. Only then did Warren signal a halt, both of them breathing hard from the exertion. "That was close," Mouse whispered, clutching the precious salvaged radio parts and documents. Warren nodded, checking the surrounding jungle for signs of pursuit. "They'll track us. We need to split up, create false trails." Mouse's eyes widened. "Split up?" "Just temporarily," Warren assured him. "Here's what we do. You head southeast, making an obvious trail. After a quarter mile, double back using the stream we crossed earlier. It'll mask your scent and prints. I'll head southwest, leaving a different trail, then circle north to meet you at the fallen banyan we passed on the way here." Mouse hesitated. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure you can do it," Warren replied firmly. "You're better at this than you think." Something shifted in Mouse's expression, confidence replacing uncertainty. He nodded. "Fallen banyan. 1 hour." 1 hour, Warren confirmed. As Mouse disappeared into the underbrush, Warren waited 30 seconds, then moved in the opposite direction, deliberately leaving signs of passage that any decent tracker would notice. Broken twigs, disturbed undergrowth, even a partial footprint in a patch of soft earth. He maintained this obvious trail for several hundred meters, then implemented the strategy he'd outlined for Mouse, using a small stream to mask his trail before doubling back through more difficult terrain where he could move without leaving signs. The maneuver would buy them time. The VC trackers would discover the ruse eventually, but by then, he and Mouse should be well on their way back to the ravine. As Warren navigated through the dense vegetation, a memory surfaced. Tommy at 16, struggling to keep up during one of their father's harsh wilderness tests. Warren had split their trail that day too, drawing their father's attention while Tommy recovered from exhaustion. He'd been punished for the deception later, but the look of gratitude in his younger brother's eyes had been worth it. The thought of Tommy brought a familiar ache. Warren had enlisted with one purpose, to find answers about his brother's disappearance. Instead, he'd found only more questions, more jungle, more war, and now perhaps a tenuous connection through Bao's journal. If the missing unit mentioned was Tommy's, Warren pushed the thought aside. Focus on the present, on survival, on the men depending on him. When he reached the fallen banyan, a massive tree toppled by some long-ago storm, its exposed roots creating a natural shelter, Mouse was already waiting, concealed beneath the tangled wooden canopy. "No pursuit yet," Mouse reported. "But they'll be coming." Warren nodded. "We move fast. Back to the ravine before dark." They made better time on the return journey, driven by urgency and the knowledge that what they carried might be their team's salvation. The radio components, secured in Mouse's pack, could give them the communication capability they desperately needed. The documents, especially Bao's journal, might provide insights into their adversaries' methods. As they traveled, Warren found himself studying Mouse with new appreciation. The young scout had transformed in just a few days, from a hesitant translator to a capable jungle fighter who moved with growing confidence. There was still innocence in him, still moral questioning, but tempered now with resolve. "My brother was like you," Warren said during a brief rest. "Always thinking, always questioning why we did things, never just accepting." Mouse looked up, surprised by the personal observation. "You don't talk about him much." "No." Warren checked their surroundings before continuing. "Talking doesn't bring him back." "What happened?" Mouse asked softly. "If you don't mind me asking." Warren was silent for a long moment. He had never discussed Tommy's disappearance with anyone in his unit before. But here, in this green hell where every day might be their last, old reservation seemed meaningless. "Special reconnaissance," he said finally, "near the border. Their last transmission reported enemy contact, then nothing. Search teams found their base camp abandoned. No bodies, no equipment, nothing to indicate what happened." "I'm sorry," Mouse said. Warren shrugged, the motion failing to disguise the pain beneath. "Army listed him as MIA, presumed dead. My father refused to believe it. Said Tommy was too smart, too tough to die out here." His jaw tightened. Maybe he was right. Maybe Tommy's still out there somewhere. "Is that why you became a survival specialist? To find him?" Warren met the younger man's gaze. To understand what happened to him, to know what he faced. He gestured at the jungle around them. "Now I do." The admission hung between them, the survivor's guilt that had driven Warren halfway across the world, into a war that wasn't his, searching for a ghost he would probably never find. "We should move," Warren said abruptly, standing still. "A few hours to the ravine." Mouse rose without further questions, respecting the boundaries Warren had established. But something had shifted between them, a deepened understanding, a shared burden. The sun was low in the sky, its light barely penetrating the canopy when they approached the hidden ravine. Warren halted them 30 meters out, suddenly wary. Something felt wrong. The air too still, the jungle too quiet around their camp. "Wait here," he whispered to Mouse. "Cover me." Moving silently, Warren approached the ravine entrance, all senses alert for danger. The camouflaged barriers they'd constructed remained in place undisturbed, no signs of enemy presence. Yet the wrongness persisted, a dissonance he couldn't identify. He slipped through the concealed entrance, M16 ready. Inside, he found Skids tending to Tex, whose color had improved markedly. Both looked up at his arrival, relief washing over their features. "Thank God," Skids breathed. "We were getting worried." Warren scanned the ravine. "Where's Dobbs?" Skids and Tex exchanged uneasy glances. "He's been in and out all day," Skids reported. "Scouting," he said, but... He hesitated. "But what?" Warren pressed. "He's been acting strange," Tex said, his voice stronger than when they'd left. "Secretive. Keeps his pack with him at all times." Warren felt a cold certainty settling in his gut. "When did he leave last?" "About 2 hours ago," Skids replied. "Said he was checking the perimeter." Warren signaled to Mouse, who quickly joined them in the ravine. "Anything to report here?" "Tex is better," Skids said, attempting optimism. "Fever's gone. Wounds cleaning up." "The radio?" Warren asked. Tex shook his head. "Still just getting fragments. Same message. Hold position." Extraction pending. Warren nodded grimly, then turned to Mouse. Show them what we found. As Mouse unpacked the salvaged radio components, Warren moved deeper into the ravine, examining their supplies. His suspicions were confirmed immediately. Items were missing. Not just food, which was scarce anyway, but ammunition, medical supplies, water purification tablets. Dobbs has been hoarding, he announced, returning to the group. Preparing to go solo. He wouldn't, Skids protested, but the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. He would, Tex countered. He's been losing it, bit by bit. Yesterday he was talking about how we're all just weighing him down. Warren's mind raced through implications. If Dobbs had indeed decided to abandon them, taking crucial supplies, their already precarious situation had just deteriorated further. Worse, if he were captured, anything he knew about their position and condition would be compromised. We need to reset, Warren decided. Tex, can you work with these components? Strengthen our signal? Tex examined the salvaged parts with a specialist's eye. Hell yes, this French capacitor alone is worth its weight in gold. Give me a few hours, I might even get us voice transmission instead of just Morse. Do it, Warren ordered. Skids, help him. Mouse, we need to reset our perimeter. If Dobbs doesn't return soon? He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They all understood the implications. As night fell, Warren stood at the ravine entrance, staring into the gathering darkness. Somewhere out there, Dobbs was making his own play for survival. Alone, paranoid, potentially dangerous, and beyond him, Bao's patient web continued to tighten around them all. The jungle seemed to press closer, its night sounds returning. Insects, distant monkey calls, the rustle of nocturnal hunters. Warren felt its weight, its ancient indifference to human suffering. But tonight, something had changed. They had Bao's journal now. They had improved radio components. They had knowledge that might tip the balance in their favor. And Warren had something he'd almost forgotten: purpose beyond mere survival. If Tommy's unit was mentioned in that journal, if there was any clue to his brother's fate. He gripped, his knife feeling the worn handle against his palm. One battle at a time. First they would survive this night. Then tomorrow. Then they would find a way through Bao's net and back to Firebase Coral. And if Dobbs had truly abandoned them, Warren silently promised, there would be a reckoning. Behind him in the ravine, Tex and Skids worked on the radio, their hushed voices, occasionally punctuated by sounds of adjustment and testing. Mouse sat nearby, leafing carefully through Bao's journal by the light of their small screened fire. They were vulnerable, hungry, isolated, but not broken? Not yet. Warren settled into position for the first watch, knife in one hand, rifle in the other, eyes scanning the impenetrable darkness beyond their hidden sanctuary. Waiting. Dobbs returned just before midnight, materializing from the darkness like a revenant. Warren, on watch at the ravine entrance, didn't hear him approach, a fact that immediately raised his suspicions. Dobbs was moving more carefully now, more deliberately, like a man with secrets. Found anything? Warren asked neutrally as the sergeant slipped through the concealed entrance. Dobbs's eyes, hollow with hunger and something darker, flicked toward Warren. Nothing. Their perimeter's tight. No way through without a firefight. Warren studied. Him, noting the bulging pack Dobbs clutched possessively. You were gone a long time for reconnaissance. Had to be thorough, Dobbs replied, moving past him toward the far end of the ravine where he'd established his separate sleeping area. Warren let him go, watching how the others reacted to his return. Skids, visibly tensed. Mouse, who'd been assisting Tex with the radio repairs, glanced up with obvious wariness. Only Tex seemed unperturbed, focused entirely on the delicate work of integrating the salvaged French components into their damaged unit. A fracture had formed in their small group, invisible but widening. Warren could feel it, a subtle wrongness, as tangible as the hunger gnawing at their bellies. Any progress? He asked, approaching Tex. The radio operator nodded without looking up, his fingers working with remarkable precision despite his weakened condition. These capacitors are exactly what we needed. I've bypassed the damaged transmitter using the French parts. Signal strength is still poor, but better than before. Good enough to reach Firebase Coral clearly? Tex hesitated. Maybe. Won't know until we try. Warren glanced toward Dobbs' corner of the ravine, lowering his voice. Try tonight, when he's asleep. Tex looked up, understanding immediately. You don't trust him, do you? The radio operator's silence was answer enough. Dawn arrived with thin gray light filtering through the canopy. Warren had slept little, dividing his attention between watch duty and monitoring Dobbs, who'd remained suspiciously inactive through the night. Now, as the team stirred to life in their hidden camp, Warren could feel tensions rising like the humidity. Hunger had become a constant companion, sharp and insistent. Their last real meal had been nearly 4 days ago. The root plants Warren had found provided minimal sustenance, and his traps remained empty. Whether from Bao's countermeasures or simply bad luck, he couldn't tell. Tex looked stronger thanks to the herbal remedies and Skid's dedicated care, but still far from combat ready. Mouse had grown visibly thinner, his already slight frame becoming almost skeletal, though his eyes remained alert and focused. Skids maintained a facade of optimism that was increasingly brittle. And Dobbs was changing in ways that set off every alarm in Warren's instincts. The sergeant's movements had become furtive, his eyes constantly scanning for threats that weren't necessarily external. He kept his pack close at all times, sleeping with it beneath his head like a pillow. We need to try the radio, Warren announced as they gathered for their morning assessment. Tech says the repairs might be enough to get a clear signal through. About time, Dobbs muttered. Maybe we can finally get out of this death trap. Warren ignored the comment, turning to Tex. How's the leg? Better, Tex replied, demonstrating by bending his knee cautiously. Still hurts like hell, but the infection's under control. I can move if I have to. Warren nodded, relieved. At least something was going their way. Let's see what Firebase Coral has to say then. Tex powered up the modified radio, adjusting dials with practiced precision. Static filled the ravine, then broken fragments of transmission, military chatter, distant and distorted. Echo team to Firebase Coral, do you read? Tex transmitted, his voice steady despite the tension evident in his face. Echo team to Firebase Coral requesting extraction coordinates. More static, then a faint voice emerged from the speaker. Receiving you. Position confirmed. Stand by for extraction. They've got us, Tex said, hope flickering in his eyes. Signal's weak, but they're receiving. Ask for a timetable, Warren instructed. And supplies. We need a drop at minimum. Tex relayed the request, but the response dissolved into unintelligible static. He tried again, adjusting the frequency slightly, but the connection had deteriorated. Battery's fading, Tex explained, frustration evident. Need to conserve what's left. So that's it? Dobbs demanded, stepping forward. More waiting? More hold position bullshit while we starve? We got through, Warren countered calmly. They know we're alive. That's something. Something isn't enough anymore, Dobbs snapped, his control visibly slipping. Look at us. We're dying by inches here. Another day, maybe 2, and we won't have strength to make it out even if they do send a chopper. Warren met his gaze steadily. What's your alternative, Sergeant? Dobbs glanced around the group, his expression hardening. We leave. Tonight. Head east toward the firebase on foot. Through Bao's perimeter? Mouse interjected incredulously. That's suicide. Staying. Here is suicide, Dobbs countered. Slower, but just as certain. Warren studied Dobbs carefully. The sergeant wasn't wrong. Their situation was deteriorating rapidly. But there was something else behind Dobbs's urgency, something he wasn't saying. All of us? Warren asked pointedly. You proposing we all leave tonight? A flicker of something, calculation perhaps, crossed Dobbs's face. Those who can keep pace, he replied, his eyes shifting briefly to Tex. And there it was. The hidden agenda finally surfaced. No one gets left behind. Warren stated flatly. We go together or not at all. Noble sentiment, Dobbs sneered. But sentiments don't keep men alive. Hard choices do. He gestured toward Tex. He can barely walk. Carrying him will slow us to a crawl, make us easy targets. Warren felt a cold anger rise within him. Tex stays with us. Then you're condemning all of us to die here, Dobbs said, voice rising. You think Bao's just going to get bored and wander off? He's strangling us, Warren, day by day tightening the noose. I know exactly what he's doing, Warren replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. I also know we don't sacrifice our own. Dobbs stepped closer, tension radiating from him like heat. This isn't one of your mountain boy survival tests. This is war. Men die. Hard choices get made. Back off, Sergeant, Warren warned. Or what? Dobbs challenged. You'll send me to my room? Take away my dinner? He laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. There is no dinner. There's nothing left but dying slow or dying fast. The confrontation might have escalated further if not for Mouse's sudden interruption. Listen, he hissed urgently. Everyone froze. Through the radio's speaker, a new transmission was coming through, clearer than before, an American voice speaking with authority. Echo Team, this is Firebase Coral. We have your position. Extraction team en route to coordinates Delta 79er. Repeat, extraction at Delta 79er. Acknowledge. Tex frowned, reaching for the transmitter, but Warren stopped him with a raised hand. Something's wrong, Warren said quietly. What do you mean wrong? Dobbs demanded. That's our ticket out. Warren shook his head, a cold certainty forming in his gut. We didn't give them coordinates. How would they know where to send an extraction team? Maybe they triangulated our signal, Skid suggested hopefully. No, Mouse whispered, understanding dawning. It's a trap. Bao's using our frequency. Warren nodded grimly. The accent was wrong too. Too perfect. Too practiced. Echo. Team acknowledge extraction coordinates, the voice repeated, more insistent now. It could be legitimate, Dobbs argued, a desperate edge to his voice. We can't ignore a potential extraction. We verify first, Warren countered. Tex, ask for authentication code. Tex nodded, understanding the protocol. He keyed the transmitter. Firebase Coral, this is Echo. Request authentication Sierra Lima. Silence followed, then. Authentication Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. Extraction team departing now. ETA, your position 90 minutes. Warren and Tex exchanged knowing glances. There was no such authentication code. It was indeed a trap, and a sophisticated one. Bao was using their hope against them, trying to lure them into the open. It's fake, Warren announced to the group. They're trying to draw us out. Dobbs stared at him, then at the radio, his expression cycling rapidly through disbelief, anger, and a strange, resigned determination. You don't know that, he said finally. It could be real. It has to be real. It's not, Tex confirmed. Authentication codes don't work that way. So we just stay here? Dobbs demanded, voice rising again. Wait until we're too weak to even crawl? We stay smart, Warren replied firmly. That's what's kept us alive this long. Dobbs fell silent, but the look in his eyes told Warren everything. The sergeant had reached his breaking point. He'd made his decision, and it didn't include waiting for consensus. Warren turned to the others. No one leaves this ravine tonight. No one responds to radio calls without verification from me or Tex, understood? Skids and Mouse nodded. Tex gave a tired salute from his position by the radio. Dobbs said nothing, merely retreated to his corner of the ravine, clutching his pack. The fracture in their unit had just become a chasm. As darkness fell, Warren organized them into watch pairs, himself with Mouse, Skids with Tex. Dobbs would take no watch tonight. Warren didn't trust the sergeant's judgment anymore, nor his loyalty to the group. Keep an eye on him, Warren murmured to Mouse as they took first watch at the ravine entrance. If he moves toward the exit, wake me immediately. Mouse nodded, his gaunt face solemn in the fading light. You think he'll try to leave? I know he will, Warren replied. Just a question of when. The night settled around them, bringing momentary relief from the day's heat but introducing new anxieties. Darkness in the jungle was absolute, impenetrable beyond the small circle illuminated by their carefully screened fire. Every sound, the distant call of a night bird, the rustle of leaves in the light breeze, carried potential threat. During their watch, Warren showed Mouse how to fashion simple perimeter alarms using vines and gathered materials, trip lines connected to suspended, clusters of dry leaves that would rustle distinctively if disturbed. "My daddy called these whisper wires," Warren explained quietly as they worked. "Not to keep people out, but to let you know when they're coming." Mouse absorbed the technique with his usual quick understanding. "Did you set these around your camp in the mountains?" Warren nodded. "Every night, even when it was just me and Tommy in the hollers." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. He used to try to sneak past them. Never could. "You miss him?" Mouse observed softly. Warren's hand stilled briefly. "Every day." They finished setting the alarms in silence, then returned to their position at the ravine entrance. The hours of their watch passed without incident, the jungle unusually quiet around them as if holding its breath. When Skids and Tex relieved them, Warren didn't immediately seek rest. Instead, he moved to a position where he could observe Dobbs while appearing to sleep. The sergeant remained motionless in his corner, but Warren doubted he was truly sleeping. There was a tension in Dobbs's posture, a readiness that spoke of imminent action. Warren's suspicions were confirmed shortly, after midnight. While Skids and Tex were focused on the ravine entrance, Dobbs slowly, silently gathered his pack and weapon. Warren watched through slitted eyes as the sergeant meticulously checked his gear, then began to inch toward the side wall of the ravine, where a narrow crevice offered an alternative exit. Warren let him get halfway there before speaking. "Going somewhere, Sergeant?" Dobbs froze, then slowly turned. In the dim light from the banked fire, his face was all angles and shadows, the hollows of his cheeks accentuated by days of hunger. "You know I am," he replied, voice low but steady. "And you know why." Warren sat up, maintaining a deceptive calm. "Enlighten me." Dobbs glanced toward Skids and Tex, who'd turned at the sound of voices, then back to Warren. "This isn't personal. It's mathematics. 5 men, limited resources, dwindling strength. Some live, some don't. I've chosen to be among the living." "By abandoning your team," Warren stated flatly. "By facing reality," Dobbs countered. "The extraction call was real. I'm going to those coordinates." "It's a trap," Warren said again. "Bow's playing mind games." "Maybe," Dobbs acknowledged with a shrug. "But it's a chance. More than we have sitting here waiting to die." He adjusted his pack. "I'm not asking you to come. I'm not asking permission. I'm going." Warren stood slowly, deliberately placing himself between Dobbs and the exit. "With supplies you stole from us." "Supplies I'm putting to use," Dobbs corrected. "Better than letting them rot here with your corpses." The naked callousness of the statement hung in the air between them. Warren could see the others watching, tension palpable in the cramped space. "You're not taking those supplies," Warren said quietly. "Put down the pack." Dobbs's expression hardened. "You going to stop me, mountain man? You're as weak as the rest of us." "Weaker, because you're still clinging to codes and honor that mean nothing out here." "If that were true," Warren replied evenly, "I'd have left you all days ago. I know these jungles better than any of you. Could have disappeared, made my own way out." "Then why didn't you?" Dobbs challenged. "Because that's not who I am," Warren said simply. "Not who any of us should be." Something flickered in Dobbs' eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or a remnant of the man he'd been before fear and hunger had stripped away his humanity. For a moment, Warren thought he might stand down. Then Dobbs's hand dropped to his sidearm. "Don't," Warren warned. "I'm leaving," Dobbs stated, fingers curling around the pistol grip. "With or without your blessing." The tension in the ravine reached breaking point. Warren calculated angles, distances, the likelihood of disarming Dobbs without anyone getting hurt. The odds weren't good. It was Tex who diffused the situation, his voice cutting through the standoff with unexpected authority. "Take the supplies," he said. "Go to your extraction point. Die on your own terms." Everyone turned to stare at the wounded radio operator, who'd pulled himself upright despite his injury. "Tex," Warren began, but Tex shook his head. "He's already gone, Sarge. His body just hasn't left yet." Tex fixed Dobbs with a level gaze. "But understand this. When you reach those coordinates and find Bao waiting instead of a helicopter, your last thought will be that Warren was right. That's your future, Sergeant. Own it." Dobbs hesitated, his hand still on his weapon. "You want to shoot your way out?" Tex continued. "Go ahead. But ask yourself, what kind of welcome do you think Firebase Coral will give a man who abandoned his team and shot his brothers to save himself?" The question landed like a physical blow. Dobbs' shoulders sagged slightly, the manic energy that had driven him temporarily deflated. "This place is death," he said finally, but the conviction had leached from his voice. "Maybe," Warren acknowledged, "but we face it together. That's the oath we took." After a long, tense moment, Dobbs removed his hand from his weapon. Without another word, he retreated to his corner, pack still clutched possessively. Warren exchanged glances with Tex, who gave a slight nod. It wasn't over, they both knew. Dobbs would try again. But for tonight, at least, the fracture hadn't become a complete break. Morning brought new challenges. Their water collection system had been producing less each day as the seep from the rock face diminished. Food was non-existent now. Even Warren's carefully placed traps remained empty. Hunger had moved beyond discomfort into a constant grinding presence that affected everything. Thinking, movement, morale. Most concerning, the radio had fallen silent. No more tantalizing false transmissions from Firebase Coral. No genuine communications either. Just static and the oppressive weight of isolation. Warren gathered the team, including a sullen, withdrawn Dobbs, for a situation assessment. "We need to change tactics," he announced. "Staying hidden isn't enough anymore. We need to break Bao's perimeter." "I thought that was suicide," Dobbs muttered. Warren ignored the barb. "It is if we try to fight through conventionally, but there's another way." He knelt, drawing in the dirt with his knife. "Mouse has been mapping their observation posts based on his scouting. There's a pattern to their coverage, overlapping fields of vision, regular patrol timings." The others gathered closer, hunger momentarily forgotten in the face of potential action. "Every defensive perimeter has a weakness," Warren continued, "usually at the boundaries between areas of responsibility, points where one unit hands off to another." Mouse nodded eagerly. "I've noticed that. There's a gap here." He pointed to Warren's crude map, between the eastern and southern sectors. "It's small, but it exists." "That's our exit point," Warren confirmed. "But we don't just walk through. We create a diversion first, draw attention elsewhere." "What kind of diversion?" Skids asked. Warren's expression was grim. "The kind that uses Bao's playbook against him. Psychological warfare." He outlined his plan. A series of traps and false trails designed not to kill but to confuse and misdirect. Triggered noisemakers placed at strategic points around their perimeter. Dummy figures made from gathered materials to draw fire. A calculated series of movements designed to make the Viet Cong believe the Americans were attempting a breakout to the north, opposite from their actual escape route. And once they're focused on the northern diversion, Warren concluded, we slip through the gap to the southeast. If we time it right, we can be halfway to Firebase Coral before they realize we're gone. The plan was met with cautious optimism from most. Even Dobbs seemed grudgingly impressed with its thoroughness, though he maintained his distance from the group. "When do we move?" Tex asked, testing his injured leg. "Tomorrow night," Warren decided. "We spend today preparing, building the diversions, setting the traps, memorizing the route. I can help with the noisemakers," Skids offered, some of his old enthusiasm returning. "I've got ideas for how to make them remote-triggered." "I'll finish mapping their patrol patterns," Mouse added. "Make sure our timing is perfect." Warren nodded, encouraged by their response. "Tex, you focus on getting stronger. Dobbs," he fixed the sergeant with a pointed look, "you help Skids with the diversions. Put those demolition skills to use." He half expected Dobbs to refuse, but after a moment's hesitation, the sergeant gave a curt nod. Perhaps the prospect of action, of finally doing something besides waiting, had penetrated his resolve to separate from the group. With renewed purpose, they set to work. Warren and Mouse ventured out to gather materials: bamboo, vines, specific types of wood that would create maximum noise when broken. Skids and Dobbs began constructing crude but effective devices that could be triggered from a distance using lengths of vine as pull cords. Throughout the day, Warren kept a careful eye on Dobbs, never letting the sergeant out of sight for long. The uneasy truce between them might hold as long as there was action to focus on, but Warren harbored no illusions about Dobbs's ultimate intentions. By late afternoon, their preparations were well underway. The diversionary devices were nearly complete. Mouse had confirmed the patrol patterns, identifying a potential 2-minute window when the gap in the perimeter would be at its widest. Tex had managed to walk the length of the ravine several times, building strength in his injured leg. It was during a brief rest that disaster nearly struck. Mouse, returning from a final scouting run to confirm their escape route, triggered one of Bao's traps, a simple but lethal punji pit concealed beneath a layer of natural camouflage. Only Warren's lightning reflexes saved him, grabbing the young scout's pack and yanking him backward, just as the ground began to give way beneath him. "Jesus," Mouse gasped, staring at the sharpened bamboo stakes now visible in the collapsed pit. "I never saw it." "Different construction than the others," Warren observed, examining the trap carefully. "Fresher, they're changing their methods." The implications were clear. Bao was adapting, anticipating their movements with uncomfortable accuracy. The net was tightening, the predator growing more certain of his prey's eventual surrender. When they returned to the ravine, they found Skids in the midst of an emotional breakdown. The young medic sat huddled against the rock wall, shoulders shaking with silent sobs while Tex attempted to comfort him. "I can't," Skids was saying, his voice cracking. "I can't keep doing this. I'm not built for it." Warren approached slowly, crouching beside the distressed soldier. "What happened?" Tex answered for him. "Pressure finally got to him. Been holding it together for all of us, but everyone has a breaking point." Warren nodded understanding. Skids had been the group's emotional cornerstone, maintaining optimism, caring for Tex, supporting everyone with his simple, steadfast presence. But beneath that exterior, he was still a 20-year-old mechanic thrust into a nightmare beyond his training or experience. "I keep seeing home," Skids whispered, not looking up. "My mom's kitchen, my dog, normal things. Then I blink and I'm back here, and it's like those things never existed. Like this is all there is." He raised reddened eyes to Warren. "What if we never get out? What if this jungle is the last thing we ever see?" It was the question they'd all silently harbored but dared not voice. The fear that had driven Dobbs to his breaking point, that gnawed at each of them in the darkest hours of night. Warren placed a hand on Skids' shoulder, feeling the trembling beneath the sweat-soaked fabric. "I can't promise we'll all make it," he said truthfully. "But I can promise this isn't the end. Not if we hold together." He glanced around at the others, including Dobbs, who watched from his corner. "The plan we've made is solid. It gives us a fighting chance, but it only works if each of us does his part." Skids wiped his face with a grimy hand. "I don't know if I can. I'm not strong like you or Mouse, not smart like Tex." "You kept Tex alive when most medics couldn't have," Warren reminded him. "You've never quit, never complained, never put yourself first. That's not weakness, Skids, that's the best kind of strength." The simple words seemed to reach something in the young soldier. He straightened slightly, drawing a shaky breath. "What do you need me to do?" he asked finally. "Finish those noisemakers," Warren replied. "Nobody knows machinery like you. Make them work, and you're saving all our lives." Skids nodded, resolve slowly replacing despair in his exhausted features. He stood with Tex's help, moving back to the partially assembled devices. Warren watched him go, aware of Mouse's evaluating gaze. "How do you always know what to say?" the scout asked quietly. Warren shrugged. "I just tell the truth. Men can handle the truth, even when it's hard. It's false hope that breaks them in the end." His eyes drifted to Dobbs, who had returned to his solitary preparations. The sergeant was a living example of Warren's observation, a man broken not by reality, but by the collapse of illusions. As night fell, their preparations continued by firelight. Warren made final adjustments to the escape route, committing each turn and landmark to memory. They would have only one chance at this. No room for error, no possibility of retreat if things went wrong. It was approaching midnight when the radio suddenly crackled to life. Everyone froze, attention riveted on the battered device as a voice emerged from the static. American, authoritative, chillingly similar to the false transmission from the previous day. "Echo Team, this is Firebase Coral. Be advised, extraction. Coordinates have changed. Repeat. New extraction point at Lima 36. Acknowledge." Warren and Tex exchanged knowing glances. Another trap, more sophisticated than before. Bao was escalating his psychological tactics, applying pressure at the moment when the Americans would be most vulnerable to hope. "Should I respond?" Tex asked quietly. Warren considered briefly, then nodded. "Play along. Let's see what they're planning." Tex keyed the transmitter. "Firebase Coral, this is Echo. Acknowledge Lima 36. Request authentication." "Authentication Bravo Zulu," came the immediate response. "Extraction team deploying at 0300 hours. Flash 3 times with signal mirror to confirm your position." Warren's eyes narrowed. The authentication code was still wrong, but the request for a visual signal was a new twist, and potentially revealing. It told them Bao wasn't certain of their exact position within his perimeter. He was fishing, using the radio to supplement his ground observations. "Acknowledged," Tex transmitted, following Warren's silent hand signals. "We'll signal at 0300. The radio fell silent again. Warren gathered the team close, speaking in hushed tones. "They're getting desperate," he explained, "trying to pinpoint us for a direct assault." "Does this change the plan?" Mouse asked. Warren shook his head. "No, it confirms it. They're expecting movement toward these fake extraction coordinates. That makes our diversion to the north even more convincing." "What if they're monitoring all directions?" Skids worried. "They are," Warren acknowledged, "but they can't be strong everywhere. When we trigger the diversions, they'll have to commit resources. That's when the gap in their perimeter will widen." He looked at each of them in turn, reading the exhaustion, the fear, but also the determination in their gaunt faces. "Get some rest," he ordered. "Tomorrow we either break through or—" He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. Tomorrow they reclaimed their fate or surrendered to it. There were no other options left. In his hidden command post a mile away, Lieutenant Bao studied the crude map his scouts had assembled of the Americans' movements. 5 days had passed since the helicopter crash. By all conventional wisdom, the survivors should have been broken by now. Starving, dehydrated, desperate enough to attempt a suicidal breakout, or signal for rescue regardless of the risks. Yet they remained elusive, contained but undefeated. "The radio deception?" Bao asked his communications officer. "They responded as expected, sir. They will signal their position at 0300. Bao nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps. Or perhaps they are playing their own game." He traced the perimeter lines on the map. "Increase patrols on the northern quadrant, but watch all sectors. These Americans, they are not like others we have encountered." His second-in-command frowned. "They are just men, Lieutenant. Hungry, isolated men. They will break like all the others." "Perhaps," Bao said again, but without conviction. He thought of the collapsed communications tower at the old French outpost, of the carefully executed ambush evasion his scouts had reported. Whoever led these Americans understood the psychological aspects of jungle warfare, understood patience and misdirection. For the first time in many campaigns, Bao felt a flicker of genuine uncertainty. He had established his reputation on being able to break the will of American units through isolation and psychological pressure, a strategy that conserved his limited resources while maximizing enemy attrition. But this group wasn't following the expected pattern of deterioration. They were adapting, evolving, becoming more like the jungle itself, silent, patient, dangerous. Bao found himself wondering about their leader. What kind of American possessed such resilience, such understanding of terrain and psychological warfare? In another life, they might have had much to discuss, soldier to soldier. "Set the sound traps," he ordered finally. "All sectors. If they move in any direction, I want to know immediately." As his men departed to execute his orders, Bao remained studying the map, fingers tracing the invisible boundaries of the deadly game they were playing. The Americans would make their move soon. He could feel it with the same instinct that had kept him alive through 2 wars. The only question was whether his carefully laid trap would be enough to catch them when they did. In the ravine, Warren lay awake long after the others had succumbed to exhausted sleep. His mind methodically worked through their escape plan, identifying potential failure points, contingencies, alternatives if things went wrong. He was acutely aware of the fragility of their situation. Tex was mobile but far from full strength. Skids was emotionally raw, his breakdown a reminder of how close they all were to psychological collapse. Mouse remained the most stable besides Warren himself, but the young scout's slender frame had little reserve energy left. And Dobbs? Dobbs was a wild card, temporarily aligned with their plan, but driven by self-preservation rather than loyalty. If the situation deteriorated, Warren had no doubt the sergeant would revert to his every-man-for-himself mentality. They were, in every sense, at the breaking point, physically, mentally, tactically. One mistake tomorrow would mean death or capture for all of them. Warren closed his eyes, forcing his body to rest even as his mind continued its vigilant planning. He thought of Tommy, of the possibility that his brother had faced a similar situation in his final days. Had he been trapped, surrounded, forced to make impossible choices? Had he found a way out? Or had the jungle finally claimed him? The questions had no answers, at least none that Warren could access here in this hidden ravine. But they fueled a deep, quiet resolve that transcended mere survival instinct. He would get these men out, not just for them, but for Tommy. For the brother he couldn't save, he would save these brothers in arms. Outside, the jungle breathed its ancient rhythm, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath its canopy. Animals called in the darkness. Insects hummed their constant chorus. Water dripped from leaves still wet from the afternoon rain. Tomorrow, Warren would turn this jungle, this green, indifferent maze that had swallowed so many men, into a weapon of his own design. He would use its secrets, its pathways, its very nature against those who thought they controlled it. Tomorrow, they would discover who truly belonged to the jungle. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, it would mean a lot.